We are continuing our information on the Italian Renaissance art, which is section 4. You can see here that we are going to begin this video discussing the architecture, doing a little comparison with the medieval architecture versus the Renaissance architecture. Mention two key examples of architects, and then we will begin going over information on specific artists. Got some great examples to share with you. So we'll look at the Florentine artists, and then we'll look at the high Renaissance artists. So you'll need both of these typed outlines to follow along with the PowerPoint video. So we're going to begin the information about the architecture by doing a little contrast first. We know that when we look at the medieval architecture, the architecture of the Middle Ages, it was characterized by the highly ornamented Gothic style. So you can see here, and I'll show you some other examples, you have a very common, highly ornamented Gothic style of the Middle Ages with these pointed arches. Really good example here of the cathedral in Milan. So you see these pointed arches. This basically represents divinity, being more divine. And again, you could see that the focus is all about on religion. This is very characteristic of cathedrals, as you can see here with this example. So these are examples of medieval architecture. Even the one in Notre Dame has those Gothic styles. So when you compare this to the Renaissance architecture, the architects of the Renaissance utilized ancient Greek and Roman forms, such as Greek temple architecture. You'll see these triangular pediments. You can see here on the Pantheon in Rome, this is what we're talking about, the triangular pediment. Okay, so that's clearly a characteristic of what the Greek and Romans did with their architecture, and now the Renaissance architects are basically copying that style. You also see they're copying Greek columns. Okay, so here, this is very characteristic of what the Greeks did with these columns. Roman arches, as well as domes. We're going to see a couple of other examples in a moment. But again, one of the better examples of Greek and Roman architecture that will be copied by the Renaissance architects is the Pantheon in Rome. So, really good example to show you. We know that the Renaissance architecture will emphasize simplicity, symmetry, and balance. So again, with this kind of, getting influenced from the Greek and Roman forms, this reflects more of a human-centered world as opposed to with the medieval architecture being more divine, okay, and centered more on religion and the church. Here's another great example of the usage of the Greek columns. This, of course, is the famous Parthenon in Athens, Greece, that was built back in 438 BCE. So again, just showing you some examples of what the Greeks and Romans did that now the Renaissance architects are going to basically copy and try to replicate. These are some of the Roman arches that will be used when the French are building this particular bridge that, as you can see here, went unfinished. And then my last example is the very famous St. Peter's Basilica. You can see here that it contains strong elements of Greek temple architecture, the Roman arches, the Roman-inspired dome, which ended up being the largest in Europe. Now, you don't have to write down these examples, but it it makes it come to life when you see the examples of what was, like this one was being built during the Renaissance time, and you can see all the influences of the Greek and the Roman styles of architecture. Two examples of architects of the Renaissance. Here is your first one, Andrea Palladio. He is one of the great architects of the Renaissance and arguably the greatest architect of any age. Pretty strong statement to live up to there. His works were based on classical styles, and a couple of his well-known works that I'll show you those examples include the Church of San Giorgio Maggiore, and that will be found in Venice. If you ever get to travel to Venice, you can see some of these great works that we're going to be looking at, and specifically the architectural work of Palladio. He also is known for a villa, which is a home in Venice, Villa Barbaro. Again, you're going to see examples of this in just a moment. Here you can see two examples of Palladio's architectural works. This first image is a well-known cathedral that he was responsible for the architecture. And then this bottom picture is, of course, of one of those villas. And I want to point out to you, this is a great example of pointing out the simplicity, symmetry, and balance that these Renaissance architects use. For example, on the right side, you see 7 archways. That is exactly replicated on the left side with 7 archways. You have 2 windows on the left, exactly 2 windows on the right. So you can see that balance and symmetry being used in the architecture during the Renaissance age. Another example of a well-known architect of the Renaissance period is Leon Battista Alberti. And all you have to know for him is that he is the architect of several cathedrals that are throughout different parts of Italy. So you can see one here and another here. So that is what he is best remembered for, a lot of his work with cathedrals. We are moving on to discuss some of the examples of the Renaissance artists that come from Florence, Italy. And the first one I'm going to go over with you is Filippo Brunelleschi. So I've got this great story to tell you about how he became so famous during the Renaissance. The city of Florence had this beautiful cathedral church, but there was just one problem. If you can tell from this picture, the cathedral is unfinished. It hasn't been completed yet. And the city leaders wanted this cathedral to be completed with a dome on top. The problem was, no one alive at the time had ever built a dome. So the city leaders didn't even know if it could be accomplished. Well, they had an idea. They decided to invite all the leading architects of the Florentine area to come and present their plans of how they would build this dome. They needed to be pretty convincing because only one architect would get chosen to do the job. And of course, this is a big job, building a dome. So one by one, the architects would come in before the city leaders and present their plans. Some of them had blueprints. Some of them had like a model example to show how they would do it. And now it's Brunelleschi's turn to present his plans before these city leaders. And when he walks in, the leaders can see he had nothing in his hands. No blueprints, no model example, nothing. So they asked Brunelleschi, how do you plan on building this dome to finish the cathedral? All Brunelleschi said to these leaders was, you give me the job, I will do it, no one else will. So the leaders sat there for a moment and said, okay, but how, Brunelleschi? You need to show us how you're going to be able to build this dome. He repeated his answer again. You give me the job, I will do it, no one else will. At that point, the leaders are getting frustrated with Brunelleschi because all these other people have come in and shown them what they could do. But Brunelleschi had appeared to have nothing to show for his work. The next thing you see is Brunelleschi pulls something out of his pocket. And what that was an egg. And he held up the egg and he said to the leaders, can an egg stand on its end? And the leaders kind of looked at each other like, that's impossible. You know, the egg's just going to roll around. There's no way it could just stand up on its end. Well, at that moment, Brunelleschi took that egg and smashed it on the table. And lo and behold, it stood up on its end without moving. And the leaders looked at each other and said, well, anybody could do that. That doesn't prove anything. So they ended up kind of discussing this, and the architects are waiting for a response, see who's going to get the job. And the next thing you hear them is announce, to everyone's surprise, that they'd like to give the job to Brunelleschi, but they'd also like one other architect that impressed them to work with Brunelleschi, and his name was Ghiberti. Well, when Ghiberti heard this, that he wasn't getting the job alone, that he was going to have to work with Brunelleschi, he stood up in outrage and said, I will not work with this man. He has no idea what he's doing. There is no way this dome is going to work. It will be an absolute failure, and we will all watch it collapse if Brunelleschi has anything to do with it. Well, even though Ghiberti refused to work with Brunelleschi, Brunelleschi still worked. He started this in 1420, and 16 years later, he finished the job. And it is still there today. Are you ready to see the finished product? There it is in all of its glory, the beautiful Duomo. So when you're filling in your outline, make sure you know that Brunelleschi is an architect of the Renaissance period, and his masterpiece is what they refer to as Il Duomo, which sits on top of the beautiful Santa Maria del Fiore, this beautiful cathedral right here. So the Duomo is his masterpiece. You can see here that it was the largest dome in the world at the time of its construction. So this, again, is what made him so famous. He's also considered the father of perspective in architecture. Okay, we'll talk about, perspective in the art world with actual paintings, but when it comes to architecture, he is going to reintroduce the concept or the technique of perspective, and so therefore earned the title of father of perspective in architecture. You might want to add that part, in architecture. Our next artist is not an architect. He is known for his sculpting. So we're going to talk about Donatello. Donatello was a great sculptor of the time of the Renaissance, and what brought so much attention to him was his bronze statue of the biblical character David. So this was the first since antiquity. Remember, antiquity refers to the ancient Greek and Roman time. So no one had seen a statue like this since the Greek and Roman time period. And you can see here, David being depicted in the Bible as a fighter. Okay, you can see he's got a sword right here. He has some type of armored helmet. So he is ready for battle. Now, Donatello was the first Renaissance artist to utilize a nude figure in sculpture.